Welcome back everybody to the Greater Sydney Landcare webinar series. It's webinar number 8 and we're very lucky to be joined tonight by Judith, Bruinsma and Kelly G from the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. And they're going to be sharing some information with us tonight about the urban heat issues in Western Sydney. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of Greater Sydney, where we're all coming from. I'm from Darug country, and just recognising the elders past and present. And I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the Greater Sydney region as the traditional land carers, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us tonight. So, yeah, we have been feeling the heat in Western Sydney. I think Penrith was about 48, almost 49 degrees in 2020. It's the hottest place on earth. And that it's predicted to get worse with climate change and the continuing rapid urbanisation. So Kelly and Judith are going to be telling us a lot more about the situation and things we can do to improve it. So thanks for joining us. A bit of housekeeping. There's a question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions throughout the evening, just click on that and type them in, and we'll come back to them at the end. All right, I'll hand over to Kelly and Judith. Thanks.
Great. So I'll get started today. First off, I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I am joining Bronwyn on Darug country today. So like Bronwyn said, today we'll talk a little bit about heat, specifically in Western Sydney, and some of the work that we've been doing. I feel like I have to acknowledge my woolen jumper while we're talking about heat, but it's actually kind of chilly here in the lower Blue Mountains at the moment, but no doubt we'll be feeling the heat again really, really shortly. So I'm joined today by my colleague Kelly G. We are both working on the Turn Down the Heat program that's being run by WSROC. So WSROC stands for the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, and we advocate and we run projects on behalf of councils in Western Sydney. So we are a membership organisation. At the moment, we've got 5 member councils, but we do run a lot of projects together in collaboration with a lot of councils across Greater Western Sydney, but then also Sydney. A lot of the projects that we are currently implementing are around urban heat and extreme heat. We do a lot in waste and sustainability and energy and emission reductions as well. I think.
Sorry, some technical issues there.
Yeah. Today is one of those days, presentations and not wanting to talk to Zoom for some reason. Are you going okay, Kelly?
Oh, there, no, it's just decided it wants to work now. Excellent.
Oh,
sorry, you're up to this screen?
Yep. Yeah, actually, yeah, so this is just a map. Yep. This is just a map where you can see sort of Greater Western Sydney region. Again, like I said, we do represent 5 councils, but work with a lot more. And we do work with councils across Sydney Metro as well, and Lithgow. So if you go to the next slide, why we're talking about heat and why we're talking about heat specifically in Western Sydney. So as you can see on that little graph on the right hand side, so these are average temperatures, mean temperatures plus extreme temperatures. The grey line you can see there is Sydney Metro, the orange line is Parramatta, and the red line is Penrith. So you kind of see that the further west we go, the hotter it gets and the more extreme temperatures we sort of experience as well. One thing to note is that this graph only goes to 2017, and like Bronwyn already said, 2020 was a pretty horrible year when it comes to extreme heat, where Penrith nearly hit that 50-degree mark and was the hottest place on earth. So we're just seeing those temperature records being broken one by one, and this is an issue that people, especially in Western Sydney, are experiencing now, but we also know that it's going to get worse in the future. So while heat is an issue across Greater Sydney, Western Sydney is particularly susceptible to heat because of its geography, so it's away from those natural sea breezes. And it also gets those hot weather domes from inland Australia on some of those really extreme heat days. In addition, we are obviously experiencing climate change, which exacerbates that heat, those heat impacts. But we're also seeing a lot of ongoing development, especially in Western Sydney, where greenfields make way for, or green places make way for hard surfaces, which really trap that heat and creates that urban heat island effect. So the slide that you see here is really to show that the impacts of heat are distributed unequally across the city. So when we know that heat impacts all of the systems of our city, so it's got really profound impact on our people, health, our environment, our infrastructure, and our economy. But when we look at that map that you can see there, where we've got those, where we've got heat, like we've got temperatures overlaid with socioeconomic disadvantage, there you can see that there's like really strong pockets in Western Sydney are emerging as being super vulnerable to heat impacts. And it's particularly due to sort of that financial disadvantage, but also because Western Sydney has higher rates of chronic diseases. In fact, it's 3 times higher in Western Sydney than it is in Eastern Sydney. And this again, it's just that system impact that we see that heat has. For example, in Western Sydney, we know that electricity use on hot days is actually double that of Eastern Sydney. So when you are then looking at those pockets of disadvantage, that becomes a real issue, and it actually becomes a life-threatening issue. So on your right, you can see a survey that we did with Western Sydney community members. So noting that these are not people who are necessarily classed as vulnerable. These are just regular and general community members that are responding to how heat has impacted them. And you can see that heat has basically an impact on most people. Most people feel some sort of impact from heat in their day-to-day life, in their health and their well-being. So again, it just shows that heat has far-reaching impacts on our community, but also on our society as a whole. So if you go to the next slide, so having set the scene in terms of what the impacts of the issue, we can see now that heat is really emerging as a major issue across policy domains. So we've listed a few sort of policy documents on the left-hand side there. So Turn Down the Heat is the strategy that WSROC developed. We developed that in consultation with 55 organisations across planning, health, infrastructure, research, community, industry, and it was a massive collaboration. And this document really sort of outlines key priorities, key actions and priorities for implementation across Western Sydney, but also Sydney as a whole. And Kelly and I, together with a lot of our stakeholders, are currently working on implementing a lot of the actions that have been listed under the Turn Down the Heat strategy. So another key document is the Greater Sydney Region Plan by the Greater Sydney Commission that really sort of identifies sort of priorities for urban planning across Sydney. And they have also recognised heat as a major issue that needs to be addressed through urban planning. And the same with Resilient Sydney, who are representing councils across Sydney Metro. And they've developed a Resilient Sydney strategy, which again identified heat as Sydney's top shock and as Sydney's biggest risk. So while a lot of those high-level policy documents identify heat as an issue, or having that sort of that policy level recognition filter through to actual action on the ground sometimes takes time. And what we've seen is that a lot of focus has been on urban greening. Obviously, urban greening is very, very important to tackle heat. But what we've seen through some of the place-based research that you see there on the right-hand side is that heat is actually really, really complex. And we need to understand the issue really, really well in order to have the right solutions in place to address the right issue. So basically what the research tells us is that heat can be mitigated to an extent for example, through greening, but extreme heat is life-threatening and we need to adapt and respond, and greening alone will not be enough to address those issues. So if we go to the next slide. So the work we've been doing with our stakeholders and through our projects, kind of sort of, we've kind of developed this resilience approach to heat, so to say. So what we say is that heat is a complex issue, it's multifaceted, and what we really need to do is step through those 4 steps on the left-hand side. So we need to assess and understand the vulnerability and the risk conditions in a place, a neighbourhood or a street, but we also need to ensure that we design buildings and places to reduce average temperatures as much as possible. But we also need to adapt to ensure that people can stay safe and comfortable in a warming climate. And we need to acknowledge that extreme heat is life-threatening and that it requires an appropriate response. So what you see on that right-hand side is basically what we advocate for that is required. So that's an integrated heat management approach. So all of those areas there, all of those wedges there will need to work together to tackle heat in Sydney as a whole. So where you can see sort of the greening come in is sort of in that sort of urban planning and the landscape management wedge, sort of on your right-hand side. But when you look through all of those other issues, there is a lot more that needs to be done. So we need to make sure that we do our emergency and recovery planning. We need to build that community awareness. We need to ensure that organisations have the resilience to cope with heat. We need to make sure that we've got warning systems that actually work and do what they need to do, and monitoring and data collection as well. We need to build infrastructure resilience to ensure that critical infrastructure can cope on those really extreme days, and also cope with that peak sort of demand that we see when we get those really hot days. We need to make sure that we know where our vulnerable people are and how to care for them. And we need to, again, do that risk assessment and the data analysis a lot better than what we're doing now. So if you go to the next slide, these are just a couple of the documents that we've produced. I know documents don't mean anything, but basically our work has been very collaborative with a whole bunch of stakeholders, and we've been doing a lot of work, particularly in the urban design and planning space. That is a very complex space, and one that we are often asked about, and a lot of people often jump to sort of that urban design when we talk about heat. So talking about sort of obviously greening, but also core materials, etc., etc. And that work, so doing a lot of research and working with a lot of our partners, has really shown us that a range of urban design measures are needed to deal with the issue of heat. So if you go to the next slide, Kelly. So the best possible outcome that we get in terms of urban cooling is when we work with a combination of both green space, ensuring that there's water in the landscape, and working with cool materials. And when we talk about trees and canopy cover, we need to sort of prioritise large canopy cover, but also we need to make sure that those trees can be hydrated. So we need to think about irrigation, especially in future climates. And so one of the photos that you see there as well is that community engagement. Again, that's so important to make sure that communities can make informed decisions, but they also understand what decisions are made in terms of the urban environment, and why those decisions are made. And again, that emergency management is absolutely critically important for us to get focused on that, to ensure that we've got those processes and infrastructure in place to respond to extreme events. And a lot more research, to be honest, is needed to actually make all of this land. So if we go to the next phase, so basically what I'm saying here is that I think we're getting a better grasp of what the issue is, what some of the solutions might be, but I guess the big question is, how do we actually make that land on the ground? How can we actually make sure that some of those things are actually happening and that we're going to see that change? And I think if you want to make Kelly and myself very depressed, these are the sort of images that we pull up when we say, like, why is this still happening? Why is we still building these sort of spaces where you can't put trees, where you just see a sea of black roofs and everything's really close together. There's no green space. We don't see water. Are these the sort of suburbs that we want to build? Obviously, the answer is no. But I think what we wanted to do today is just talk through some of the, while we know what research tells us, we know kind of high level what we need to do. What we wanted to share with you today is, through some of our work, what some of the challenges have been in actually making some of that stuff land on the ground, but then also talk through some of the solutions that we can see. So I will actually hand over to Kelly to talk about the meaty part of this presentation, the challenges of actually making this stuff work. Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Judith. I go with it. Yeah, depressing stuff. Oops. Now my clicker has stopped working again just because I'm up. Sorry about this.
That's all right.
Oh, there we go. So challenges, there's a lot of them, as we've discovered and been learning as we go. I guess starting with greening, which you'll all be fairly familiar with. As Judith mentioned, there has been some really great focus on greening across the city and building that canopy cover. However, when we look at urban environments, particularly verges and more built up areas, there are some really significant design challenges to overcome. So the first is that street verges are highly contested spaces. Trees need to compete with parking, they need to compete with footpaths and utilities, both overhead and under the ground, and cycleways. And there's an increasing number of things that people and policymakers are wanting to fit into that nature strip or that verge space. You can see in the tree on the right there, that's a pretty mature tree. It's been there for a little while, but because it's been continually trimmed back to keep it away from those power lines overhead, it's not really providing the type of canopy cover that we would be aiming for when we're looking at urban greening strategies. So yeah, that tree's having a bit of a challenging time getting up and getting that really luscious canopy happening. Also, in terms of urban areas, they're not really designed for promoting healthy canopy or tree growth. So traditionally, there hasn't been a lot of space underground for the roots of trees to develop, and the root system does correspond with the size of the canopy. But also, when we look at stormwater management systems, traditionally they have been designed to flush water out of our cities as quickly as possible, and that really prevents that water from soaking in and providing the trees with the moisture that they need to grow and be healthy. So while urban areas can be very hostile, and that's not even to mention, you know, getting hit by cars and trailers and people going by and people wanting to rip trees out. So WSROC is doing a bit of work with Western Sydney University Which Tree Where program. If you're not familiar with it, it's, as it suggests, they're looking at which tree species should be planted in which locations. And that's really important to better understand which trees are suited to street side plantings in Western Sydney, given the really extreme climate that we do have and the lower levels of rainfall that we have in Western Sydney. And that project also integrates some passive irrigation pits to look at how we can better support tree growth, particularly in those early years when we do that planting. The second set of challenges are around governance, and this is a really, I guess, a broad set of challenges that Judith's already touched on a little bit. As we mentioned, heat's a really broad-ranging issue, and it can't be easily put under one government agency or one ministry. So that does make it difficult to tackle in a holistic sense, because no one has full carriage of the issue. Particularly in the planning space, as we mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work in that space. Heat is a really new issue for urban planning, and as we mentioned, a lot of those big strategic documents talk about the importance of managing heat. but actually getting that change happening on the ground requires really specific sets of rules and updates to planning codes and building codes that takes quite a bit of time to translate the science that our researchers are producing into practical outcomes that can be upheld in court and that can be enforced by our governments. The third point there is around rating systems. So traditionally in our built environment, we look to rating systems like Basics or Green Star to address some of our sustainability outcomes for buildings. However, because heat is a relatively new issue, and particularly urban heat, a lot of these rating systems equate thermal comfort with energy efficiency. And obviously energy efficiency is a really good thing to strive for. However, that does mean that when houses are designed, you can make up for a poor house design with air conditioning. So as long as you can kind of offset that not so great design with air conditioning, there isn't really that incentive to drive better design. And it's also really challenging for lower income groups. As we mentioned before, there's a lot of people in Western Sydney living in those really, really hot areas who either don't have access to air conditioning, or even if they do, they can't afford to run it. So actually designing buildings with a reliance on air conditioning has really big equity challenges for our city. And the final challenge I'll talk about here is policy conflicts. And obviously there's lots of different competing interests in the policy space. Different people want different things from different sectors. And one of them I wanted to point out is WSROC guidelines. So these are guidelines developed by engineers that specify how we design safe roadways in Sydney. And unfortunately, for those wanting to see more canopy cover, currently the WSROC guidelines state that you shouldn't be planting trees on roadsides over 60 kilometres per hour without a really large amount of clear space between the roadway and the tree, which makes it impractical in an urban setting. The purpose of that is to make sure that if someone has a bit of a swerve on the car, they don't actually hit the tree and injure themselves. However, that is, I guess, quite a narrow-minded view of the challenges of trees. So we know that trees also provide a lot of benefits around biodiversity. They can actually provide a barrier between the road and pedestrian areas, protecting people. And they also have really great outcomes in terms of urban cooling, protecting people from UV radiation in terms of shading. There's a whole range of, I guess, benefits to trees as well. And I'll just skip down to the bottom because Blacktown City Council, one of our members, is currently working on a project to really broaden out that risk assessment around trees on roadsides to try and open up some more planting opportunities across our city, because we know that's really important. And so in terms of the solutions, I think we mentioned that we have been really working hard with a lot of our partners to translate the science that we know into practical planning controls that can be put into place on the ground. And we've provided some resources for local councils to do that. However, in Western Sydney, we know that around half of development does go through state planning pathways. And so our next step is to really try and push that at the state level. Some of you may have heard in the last week or so that the government announced they'll be enforcing light-coloured roofs at the new Wilton estate down in Camden, and that's a really fantastic outcome, and it'd be great to see that expanded out across the city. The next set of challenges are cultural factors, and I think these are probably some of the ones we maybe talk about less, but are quite challenging to address. So in Australia, and particularly in Western Sydney, it has always been hot, and people just tend to take that as a given and put up with it and don't think that there's anything they can necessarily do to change that. There's also within communities often a negative view of trees with a lot of people, and I know a lot of people today will be tree lovers and will find that a bit hard to reconcile with, but a vast majority of the complaints that councils receive are around trees, whether it's trees on neighbouring properties or wanting to remove trees from their own properties due to perceptions of trees being unsafe and dropping branches, or being messy or destructive in terms of lifting footpaths and getting into stormwater drains. So they're really, I guess, when we're thinking about planting trees, we really do need to work with communities. And that picture on the right there is a program that ran in Blacktown Council area around working with communities to teach the benefits of trees. So they're not only thinking about the negatives. There's also at the bottom of the page there, you can see a typical kind of Western Sydney development that's currently going in the outer parts of the city. And I guess what you see there is a lot of black roofs, quite large houses taking up the majority of the block. And often people like to point the finger at developers when it comes to this type of thing, but the reality is it's not that simple. A large part of that is because it's a preference. People like having a large house. They like having a detached house and a standalone home, and it's fashionable to have a black roof at the moment. So there is a really big part of community preference in that as well. And the flip side of that is a lack of appreciation of the benefits of cool design and greening. So a lot of people, when they're building new homes or they're making upgrades, they're not really thinking about what's going to save them energy or what's going to be sustainable or what's going to be more comfortable to live in. They're thinking about aesthetic preferences or what they saw on the block last week in terms of what they want in a new home. So in terms of solutions, there is increasing awareness that the built environment does contribute to heat, which is fantastic. I think we've seen that increasingly coming through social media in the last few years. And I know a lot of our councillors have mentioned that community members are increasingly raising that as an issue that they're concerned about. But there is still a lot more work to be done, working with communities, giving them the information to make informed choices when they're either upgrading their home or building a new home or choosing somewhere to live. And the last challenge, and it's definitely by no means the least, because we know economic factors are a major contributor to the way that our city looks and is being developed. The cost of trees is quite significant. And we have had some really fantastic programs like the 5 Million Trees Initiative, where the state government has funded a lot of tree planting through councils and organisations such as Landcare. However, that funding only pays for the tree itself. And there is a lot of cost that goes into the planting of those trees, the maintenance, watering, making sure those trees actually reach that mature canopy stage. And particularly for councils looking to plant those trees in urban areas, it can be particularly expensive because there's additional infrastructure requirements like root barriers to make sure that those trees don't damage any infrastructure nearby. So I guess when we're thinking about tree planting, as much as we all want to do it, it is a costly process, and that can sometimes impact on where and when and how it occurs. Housing affordability is also a consideration. Obviously, we'd all love to have huge verges with lush green gardens and trees and big backyards, but ultimately, any land that's dedicated to that type of purpose rather than being used for housing is going to cost someone money, whether it's the government, whether it's developers, or whether it's the person buying the home. So there are pressures, I suppose, on the amount of space we dedicate to trees in new urban environments. And a related issue is the commodification of housing. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about our increasing tendency to view our home as a piece as an investment. And I guess for some people, they might have multiple investment properties that they rent out to others. So if I'm buying a new piece of land and I want to build a home, and I've paid quite a lot of money for that land and I have a huge mortgage already, I'm more likely to build a larger home than a smaller home, because if I go to resell that or if I go to rent it out, I'm going to receive more money and more return on investment for a 5-bedroom home as opposed to a smaller 3-bedroom home. So that often, I guess, leads to when you see houses taking up a larger proportion of the block in new developments. So in terms of solutions, funding programs, there's some great funding out there for tree planting, which is fantastic. WSROC's also been working on a program called a rating tool called Cool Suburbs, which really takes a more holistic view of heat and seeks to incentivize better design, not just that internal thermal comfort of a home, but also the comfort of external spaces through shading and good use of water and cool materials as well. So we're really hoping that by further promoting what is good design and what is comfortable and livable design, we'll see more demand for that in the future. And just a quick mention that, you know, all parts of this system need to work together. There's a need to further connect research with practice on the ground. There's a real need to engage leaders and decision makers who many of them don't live and work in Western Sydney or don't have first-hand experience of the challenges that people face in our region. Working with industry is really important. Developers and builders and construction have a really big role to play in delivering better outcomes in the built environment. And finally is media and awareness raising. Programs like Fight for Planet A that was on ABC, I say last year or the year before, I've lost track of time, but it's really important to make people feel like they do have agency and ability to make a difference in their own household and in their own set portion of the world, and give people some opportunity to take action. So with that, I'll hand back to Judith to talk about some exciting projects.
There's only 2 slides left, so but yeah, I think we just wanted to focus on some of, I know Kelly's mentioned a few of the programs that we're either doing or that are happening sort of across the board. We just wanted to highlight some of the projects that councils are undertaking at the moment. So most councils have urban canopy strategies or targets that they are working towards, and pretty much all of our councils are using the 5 million trees funding to actually plant more trees and make that sort of urban greening a real priority for them. But some of the other projects that are currently being implemented that sort of address that urban design in a more holistic way even are some of the projects that I've listed here. So on the left-hand side, you've got a program that was developed by Penrith together with UTS and many other stakeholders that looked at developing or designing a cool bus shelter. So as Kelly said, like, infrastructure is a key part of making sure that our infrastructure is adapted to those extreme temperatures is a key part of what we should be considering, especially making sure that if people need to be mobile during hotter days and heat events, we need to ensure that those people who may not have cars, that they can still get around the city. So prioritising cool design in things like bus shelters is absolutely critical. And going on from that is the next photo. It's a cool playground that was developed by Cumberland City Council in collaboration with the University of Western Sydney and a whole bunch of industry stakeholders. So again, Cumberland trialled cool design, so it includes tree planting and canopy cover for that playground, but also shade and different sort of types of materials, what sort of irrigation they're using. And that design is then sort of being shared with other councils, so that could potentially be replicated across the board. Like we said before, while we need to adapt our urban environment for people to be able to do their day-to-day things when it gets hotter, we also need to be prepared for those really extreme heat events. Things like we saw a 2 months ago in the United States, the northern part of America and Canada. Those really extreme heat events, no amount of tree planting or cool suburbs design is going to assist us. We just need to make sure that people can actually shelter in place. So, and if people can't shelter in place because we've got wide-scale power outages, we need to ensure that we've got things like cool refuges in place. So this is a project that Blacktown City Council's actually trialling at the moment to work with their community organisations to skill them up and to be able to provide cool refuges to those people who are most vulnerable. while it sounds like an easy thing to do, it is quite complex, because you need to ensure that you've got your power backup, you need to ensure that your refuge is accessible, so what you do with transport, what you do with people who may need medical support, etc., etc. So it is quite a complex thing to work out. So this is a collaboration between Blacktown and their community organisations, and it is one that we're all keeping a keen eye on to see whether we can replicate that across Western Sydney as well. So on the bottom left there, you can see a lot of councils have done microclimate research together with Western Sydney University. So these reports were developed by Parramatta, Campbelltown, Penrith and Cumberland have done this microclimate research. And that really, so they're basically temperature loggers to see sort of what the temperature does on a very, very small scale. So what you can see with these reports is that even streets a couple of meters apart from each other can have huge variances in terms of temperatures. I think we logged 2 streets adjacent to each other in Parramatta with a 10-degree or even more difference. And a lot of that has to do with orientation, but also tree canopy. So those reports really allow councils to prioritise their efforts, either through urban greening, but also other urban cooling strategies. And it also provided us as WSROC with a lot of information to call for better urban heat management to our state government and our other local government partners as well. So that photo down the bottom in the middle, you can see that's a project that was done by Campbelltown, Parramatta and Blacktown, and they're trialling a cool sealant on roads to make sure that that sort of heat doesn't sort of radiate, especially at night, because high nighttime temperatures are particularly bad for people's health. So that's a trial that has just been completed, and the research reports available through Western Sydney Uni. They assisted with this research. And on the right-hand side, so a big chunk of the work that we've been doing together with councils is assisting councils with how to address heat through their urban planning instruments. So councils are currently working through updating their local environment plans and their development control plans. So those documents basically set out priorities, what sort of development will is allowed in that LGA or in that council area or not. So there's what we've been trying to do with councils is looking at how heat can be addressed through those guidelines and documents, and that's been quite a chunk of work, and a lot of councils are really making headway in that space. And like Kelly said before, this is a new issue for councils in this space, so this is the first time that heat is actually now making its way into these strategic documents that actually have legal weight. In addition to sort of all of these projects, there is a lot happening in this space. So councils have procurement policies. There's also a lot of water sensitive urban design work going on. Councils are really looking at upping their engagement with communities in this space, and a lot of them have communication strategies and programs around that. And there's social housing collaborations happening as well. So if we go to the next slide, that's the last slide, and then I think we've talked enough. So there's, like we said, I think there's a lot happening in this space, but there's obviously a lot that people like yourself or Landcare can sort of assist with in elevating this issue across the board. Obviously, first of all, I mean, the work that Landcare is doing is amazing, and absolutely continue with getting more trees in the ground and getting more green space. That is so important. Where possible, it might be an option to consider planting in urban areas rather than in parks and reserves, just to make sure that we sort of tackle that urban heat island effect and that localized climate temperatures. And obviously just sort of planting in your own, but I know we're sort of preaching to the converted here, planting in your own backyard, front yard, and wherever you can. In addition, there is an opportunity to really use your voice to provide feedback on some of those key strategic planning documents that we've got listed on this slide. So at the moment, the New South Wales government is working through a new state environmental planning policy. So that's the design and play step. What WSROC is doing at the moment is trying to make sure that heat is really elevated as part of that step. So again, the state environment planning policy really sets out what can and can't be done in terms of it's a legislative, it's carries legal weight, and it sets out sort of minimum requirements in terms of urban design. So some of the things that we are advocating for, and you can absolutely find all our submissions on our website as well if you are interested. But in terms of heat, some of the things that we are advocating for, and that it would be great to get communities to advocate for similar things, is to ensure that heat is obviously recognised as a key issue. Deep soil requirements for trees are really, really important to be able to establish that sort of healthy canopy cover. Like Kelly said before, species selection. So selecting species that actually prioritise cooling or that have sort of that larger canopy cover. Focusing on retention of existing trees is a really good one, rather than sort of allowing trees to be removed and then sort of offset elsewhere. And consideration of passive irrigation. So making sure that trees have access to some form of irrigation that can actually be sustained even in dry periods. So again, a lot of what we've been advocating for is actually on our website as well. Another thing that we advocate for, and that we would be very happy for communities to support us in, is to advocate for heat to become a Premiers Priority. So while we've got a Premiers Priorities centred around sort of the 5 million trees program, which is fantastic, we are hoping that sort of heat can be addressed in a more holistic way to ensure that it's not just trees in the ground, but those trees are supported by that urban environment so that they can actually grow to healthy trees and that healthy canopy that actually keeps our urban areas cool. So besides the New South Wales government, there's also a lot that you can potentially do with your local council. So local governments are currently reviewing a lot of their planning policies and guidelines as well. All of these documents go through public consultation. So similar issues, you can always look at sort of how your council is addressing green space, how your council is addressing heat, and make some of those suggestions or ask those questions. And lastly, so we've got, so I've listed sweltering cities there. So sweltering cities is a community advocacy organisation that really looks at that heat as an issue for Western Sydney. They've got a lot of information available, and they do a lot of advocacy to politicians and local members, but also upskill community members. So it's definitely worthwhile having a look at their website and sort of seeing if that's something that you're interested in enjoying as well. So I think that was it from us. So all of our information in terms of what we do around heat is listed on our website. Website's listed there. Feel free to ask us any questions, and there is quite a bit of information out there. And we hope that was useful. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
I have a question for you, actually, just for us and our tree planting. What sort of difference does it make in terms of temperature reduction, in terms of having like that extra canopy cover? Is it possible to know like the difference it makes, like particularly like in a street, things like that, if there's good canopy cover?
Kelly, sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback, I think. There's definitely a lot of data out there that sort of talks about the difference it makes. It does depend very strongly on what that urban design is. So it depends on sort of what sort of buildings are surrounding or what sort of street you're talking about. Like I said, in Western Sydney, I think we've measured, was it over like 15 degrees difference? But again, the one thing to keep in mind is, again, that the difference can be quite stark, but only when those trees are healthy. So we have done measurements with Western Sydney University in parklands, and those parklands were actually hotter than some of the suburbs because it was a really, really dry summer and it was an extreme heat event. So there is a tipping point where trees actually don't provide that cooling benefit anymore, just because they hold it like that. Normally you get that cooling benefit from shade, but also from evapotranspiration. So the water that they sort of expel. There is a tipping point, and I don't know if we can really pinpoint that tipping point. I think it's even over 35, no more.
Yeah, and I think it depends on species as well.
Yeah, true.
Obviously.
But then they actually hold on to that water, and that can mean that trees can actually become really, really hot as well. Sorry, Kelly, did you have any further? You're way better than that.
No, I was just going to say it is, yeah, it's really complicated, I guess, is the answer, depending on, yeah, species and how hydrated they are, and, you know, how much heat is in the environment and what time of day it is and how the airflows are moving in that street. So, yeah, as Judith said, there's been measurements of 10, 15 degrees, but it is very place dependent, which I guess is why all those elements, the water, cool materials and the trees together are kind of, that's why we promote that, as opposed to leaving trees by themselves to do all the heavy lifting and be suffering in the heat when we are as well.
Okay. And so just in terms of, because you mentioned that, so for us, for example, Greater Sydney Landcare, we're planting a lot in sort of bushland areas, but you were sort of encouraging people to plant more, obviously, around houses and things like that for the cooling effect. But is that something then that we'd have to get council approval for, and that's for those sorts of spaces? And then you were mentioning that, like, along the roadside, there's different limitations. So there's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
So yeah, it is quite a complex case, and yes, and I absolutely don't want to take away from the work and the need to plant in reserves and parks and the likes, because that's absolutely needed as well. So what that can do is, with sort of depending on sort of which way sort of the wind goes, it can actually, like, if you have good green spaces that are well irrigated, those winds can go through those parks or go through those reserves, hit those urban areas and still provide a bit of cooling benefit. But to really get that cooling benefit, particularly for those dwellings or those streets, we need to make sure that heat's not just, or that green space is not just in those pockets, but it's actually dispersed throughout the suburbs. And you're right, so a lot of that will require council approval or other approvals, depending on who owns the land. A big chunk, obviously, there's a lot of land is private land. So one thing that I know councils and state government as well are encouraging is for people to plant trees in their own backyards or front yards, but obviously there's a bit of guidance needed as well in terms of species selection and how to care for those trees, etc., etc.
Okay.
Sorry, Kelly, did you want to add to that?
No, but I guess councils have canopy targets as well. So if people want to approach their council to ask to plant on the verge outside their house, I'm fairly sure that councils would be quite supportive with some information on how to do that appropriately.
Yeah.
Okay. And then that's part of that, which tree where that with the Western Sydney Uni, so they're sort of advising on what's the best sort of variety to plant in that situation, like in that context.
Yeah, so as you probably know, in terms of species selections for trees, there is a bit of a balance to be had. Like at one point, we obviously want those trees to provide that cooling benefit, but we also want them to survive in that warming climate. So what some of the research from Western Sydney Uni shows us is that a lot of the trees that we're planting now are actually really vulnerable to that hotter climate, and they might actually fail. So I think 30% of the species that we've got planted at the moment are at risk of failing in that warming climate. So we need to think carefully about it, because we're planting trees that will give us benefit in, say, 20 or however many years, because they still need to grow. But we can't plant those, we should not be planting trees that in 20 years time are not going to provide us that benefit either. So it is a bit complex in that sense. So Western Sydney Uni, together with Macquarie Uni, they've got that Which Plant Where project. So they're really trialling what species are most resilient to that sort of warming climate. And on top of that, they're looking at some of those additional benefits in terms of cooling, et cetera, et cetera. Like our bottle brushes are beautiful, but they're probably not the best trees in terms of when we talk about cooling benefits. So it kind of is also selecting what species is good for that future climate, and also what purpose do we want that tree to fulfill as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that would be interesting, yeah, for us to get in contact with Western Sydney Uni as well. See.
Yeah, and I guess as well, like obviously a lot of the planting that's done in parks and reserves is also for biodiversity benefit as well. So there's all these kind of trees provide so many benefits, but I guess in terms of the which plant where, that's really the question, is what trees fulfill which purpose, and which one should we be looking at in different locations and to fulfill different roles in our urban spaces.
Yeah, great. All right. And then, yeah, I guess the residents can all sort of participate by planting some trees on in their block, I guess, too, huh?
Yeah, and a lot of councils as well do free tree giveaways at various points throughout the year. So definitely recommend for people to keep an eye out for those as they come up across the year from council nurseries.
Oh, great. All right. Did anyone have any questions that's watching? Any other additional questions? Or Judith or Kelly? All right. So what we'll do, this video is going to go out to everyone that registered, and then it's still going live on Facebook. So I'll send that out to everybody after we finish. So thank you very much, Judith and Kelly. Did you have any closing comments or anything else you wanted to add? Or
I'm just seeing the question from Matteo in the
they're coming through. Okay, great. Yeah, so Matteo's just said, could there be a tipping point where the temperatures will be too high, actually be able to establish anything at all?
I think that's actually a really, really good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but I expect there will be, but I don't know what that tipping point would be. But that's, again, why all of those things, I think, need to work together. So climate change mitigation is obviously a big chunk of what we need to do to hopefully not get to that point. But yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll be asking that, but I'm not sure what the tipping point might be. Looking at some sort of countries like Dubai and the likes of United Emirates, there's not a lot of trees there, so I imagine that at some point there won't be a suitable climate for trees, but I don't know. Kelly?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry.
All right, and Jasmine just mentioned that she would like to follow up. And she says thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, great.
Thank you.
All right, so yeah, thank you so much. It was really informative in breaking all of that down for us. And yeah, as I mentioned, that video will go out to everybody and will be available online. So yeah, we'll be circulating that as well, share. And just in terms of Greater Sydney Landcare, yeah, as Judith and Kelly mentioned, so we're doing a lot of tree planting, so part of our Creating Canopies project. So that's part of the New South Wales Premiers Priority. So yeah, greening the city. So we're planting 100,000 trees by the end of 2022. So if you're a landholder and you're interested in planting trees, we can help you out. Just get in contact, or if you want to get your hands dirty and get some trees in the ground, you could come and volunteer with us. We'll have some tree planting days, probably at the beginning of next year, just due to COVID. So you can jump on our website, it's greatersydneylandcare.org, or jump on our Facebook page and you can see what's coming up. All right, so thanks very much again. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, keep your eye out for the video link. And yeah, we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another webinar with Hooked on Nature, and they'll be talking about the different ecology, all the different animals that live in the urban and peri-urban areas of Greater Sydney. So that'll be pretty cool. All right, cheers, take care, and we'll see you again. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone, bye.